welcome back to the Fire Burns Within channel. Time to continue with this musical journey series of videos. Finally we reach part 3. I've fully discovered metal now. We've reached around 1994, 95. So I'm discovering more and more metal bands. I've started out on Metallica like most people do, but obviously I started much later than a lot of people do. Well, it depends what age you are, of course. If you're of the right age, you would have started originally in the 80s. But in the 80s, I was not a metal kid. I was just a normal kid listening to music. But anyhow, I got into metal eventually, and then I got into... straight away, pretty much like after 1 or 2 years of trying out bits and pieces, I got into the heavy stuff first, which is quite odd, I think, you know, to go straight to the death metal and thrash metal first, and then switch to the softer stuff maybe later. Normally people start with the soft and then switch to the heavy. Well, I'd sort of started with the soft a little bit and then switch quickly. Anyway, by around 94, 95, I was starting to follow the melodic death metal scene in Sweden quite a bit. It was sort of like a burgeoning scene. And it leads me on to my 15th album in my musical journey, which is this one. It's At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul, which... it's just a phenomenal album. I mean, this is... I don't think... I mean, if I was going to make a list of my favourite melodic death metal albums of all time, I would think this is up there, either first or second, probably first. I mean, I've made lists of my favourite melodic death albums before, and I've always put At the Gates top... alongside, of course, with In Flames, The Jester Race, and Dark Tranquillities. Well, either The Gallery or my favourite one, The Mind's Eye. But those ones don't get to go on this list of albums, but Slaughter of the Soul does. I mean, it's just an amazing release. It's a really short album. It's not like an overlong album. It's just over 30 minutes. It's to the point. It's catchy. It's heavy. I mean, the riffing standard is so, you know, it's just when you listen to it, it's like the guitars are just full on. I mean, the production is really good for mid-90s. It's a classic of melodic death metal. I mean, for me, it doesn't get much better than that one. So that one easily makes my list. And that's the 15th album in this journey out of 50. Okay, next. This is the time in 1995-6 where I've discovered melodic heavy metal. Okay, Iron Maiden started it, like I said before, with Live After Death and then listening to Maiden. But I didn't really know about the European power metal scene. I had no clue. Not much of a clue at all. I didn't know Halloween, I didn't know Gamma Ray, I didn't know European bands, you know. I know they were in the doldrums a little bit at that time as well, so they weren't fully coming to the fore, but I just didn't have a clue. But eventually, this album came along, and I didn't hear it exactly on release date, but I think maybe about 6 months to a year later, and I'm talking about this album, Gamma Ray's Land of the Free. This album was awesome. I mean, it opened my ears to melodic heavy metal. I wasn't really aware of too much of it apart from Maiden, you know. I was unaware of this scene, this European power metal scene. So I really sort of grabbed onto it. It was a new listening experience. So, you know, this, I would say this is probably the first real European power metal album I heard. And then once I heard this, I started going in, delving deeper, you know, checking out a little bit older Gamma Ray, a little bit older Halloween, some other bands as well. I didn't quite get around to my absolute favourites, which is Running Wild, until a bit later, which I will go into. But Gamma Ray, Land of the Free, absolutely awesome album. You know, when I first heard this album, you know, the opening track, I think, is it the opening track, Rebellion in Dreamland? It might be, or it might be one of the tracks in between. I just blew my mind, that song. I was just hooked by it. You know, it was just, it's a light bulb moment. You know, power metal, melodic metal exists in this world. You know, it's just a great moment. And since then, I'm hooked on melodic heavy metal, power metal, whatever you want to call it, classic heavy metal. Okay, the next album I have to mention is also released in '96. I heard this literally at the time it was released. Again, it's a similar sort of band, but it takes me to a different style of power metal. And this was Manowar's Louder Than Hell. Now this album, I remember buying it in a shop in near Oxford Street, and in a CD shop. And I just bought it mainly because of the cover, almost, because it had that big barbarian guy on the cover with his sword up in the air like that. I thought, yeah, this looks like it could be fun. It could be like, because I was getting into power metal, and this looked really heavy and power metal. And when I first heard it, I was a little bit disappointed. I know a lot of people consider this sort of a weaker Manowar record, but I didn't know any Manowar beforehand. This is my introduction to Manowar, so I was a little bit so on it, because it sounded quite raw but also cool as well. But I really got into this album after a while. I mean, it's very cheesy, but I was embracing all the cheese, you know. Pour on the cheese thick, you know. That's the more the thicker the better at this point. So I grew to love this album. It was my introduction to Manowar. So it makes the list to introduce me to a sort of different kind of power metal, the true metal kind. Okay, the next album I want to mention is also in the power metal vein. It was released a couple of years later. Now in 1997, this band released their debut album, and of course I'm talking about Hammerfall. Now the debut album I heard, but I wasn't so, like, I didn't get the immediate hype. I saw that they were like this, you know, this catchy, speedy, melodic power metal band from Sweden. You know, this new band come to save melodic heavy metal, and they did do that. I mean, Hammerfall are the band that brought the European power metal scene back to life, you know, from the dead. I mean, Gamma Ray was still going. I think Halloween was still going. But these bands were sort of very, I don't know, maybe they were treading water, and it needed something along the lines of Hammerfall to come along. But the album I'm going to mention is their second album, this one, Legacy of Kings. I just absolutely fell in love with this album. This album was so catchy to me. The production is much better than the debut album. It's sort of fuller, thicker. The band has honed their craft a little bit more. It's a really catchy album. This album really brought me into the European power metal scene. You know, I became sort of fixated a little bit with the European power metal scene. You know, I started just constantly searching for European power metal bands, which leads me on to the next album I want to mention, and that is Rhapsody's second album, Symphony of Enchanted Lands. Now Rhapsody, I sort of fleetingly heard the debut. It didn't register hugely with me, but when this second album came out, wow, it blew me away. It was, the production was much better. I mean, I hadn't heard symphonic metal too much before, because Hammerfall is obviously not symphonic at all. They're like a sort of mix between Priest and Accept. So, you know, that they were that type. And then when I heard Rhapsody, I was like, wow, well, what's this now? This is so over the top. This is so bombastic. You know, huge choirs. Even Like, you know, the instrumentation is so huge, everything is like set to maximum. So I definitely have to give credit to this album for again cementing my love for European symphonic power metal. So definitely another big milestone for me. And then another album I hinted at earlier that I discovered for the first time at this point was Running Wild, and the album The Rivalry, which was the very first time I'd heard any Running Wild at all, and I totally fell in love with Running Wild. I mean, before that I hadn't really even heard a note, but then after I heard The Rivalry, I went back and checked out the other ones. I quite like them, but they never seem to match up to The Rivalry. I don't know what it was with The Rivalry. I just absolutely loved it. I mean, I do love the other ones as well, the previous ones. The two early Running Wild albums are very sort of raw and rough. I know people like them and they're cult releases. They're sort of harder edge. They haven't got the pirate theme. But Running Wild, with their pirate antics on, say, The Rivalry and all the albums after the first two, they really sort of... They were capturing my Germanic side of my metal worship, you know. At first it was Gamma Ray, but then I sort of put Gamma Ray to one side and I was full into Running Wild. I mean, this album, The Rivalry, to this day, it's probably my second favourite or close to favourite. Depends. The other one I really love is Death or Glory. Quite a few albums before this, but The Rivalry, I mean, it's just it's a milestone album for me, so it easily makes it to this part of the video. Okay, so I've talked for 11 minutes again. I need to speed these up and not talk so much, so we'll leave the rest for the next video. This is going to be a long series of videos, I guess. So okay, stay tuned for the next episode.